What if I told you that your DNA could unlock secrets hidden for thousands of years, stories of ancient tribes long forgotten, mysterious migrations that reshaped entire nations, and connections that stretch far beyond Scotland's rugged shores? Imagine discovering that your Scottish ancestry isn't just linked to Celtic warriors or medieval kings, but traces back to fierce tribes from the Sahara Desert or even nomadic hunters from the icy plains of Siberia. Sounds unbelievable, right? But recent genetic studies have revealed exactly that. Astonishing connections that challenge everything we thought we knew about Scotland's past. Beneath every stone circle, every ancient fortress, and every family name lies a genetic thread woven through time, carrying whispers of lives lived in distant eras. From the early hunter-gatherers who first stepped onto Scottish soil after the last ice age to the fierce Picts who stood their ground against Roman legions, Scotland's DNA is like a time machine. It doesn't just tell us where people lived, it reveals who they were, where they came from, and the incredible journeys that shaped them. And here's the twist. Scotland's hidden history isn't locked away in dusty books or ancient ruins. It's in the blood of modern Scots, in the genetic markers that scientists are just beginning to decode. Your DNA might be carrying the story of an ancient North African traveler, a Viking settler, or even a lost Celtic tribe whose name has faded from history but whose legacy lives on in you. So, what secrets does your DNA hold? Scotland's history is often told through epic tales of battles, legendary kings, and ancient castles perched on misty cliffs. But what if I told you that the real story, the one that's been hidden for thousands of years, isn't carved in stone or written in faded manuscripts? It's written in our DNA. Beneath the surface of Scotland's rugged landscapes lies a genetic code that holds the key to untold chapters of human history. Chapters that challenge everything we thought we knew about who the Scots really are. Recent breakthroughs in genetic research are peeling back the layers of time, revealing connections that stretch far beyond Scotland's borders. Scientists have discovered that the DNA of modern Scots isn't just a simple story of Celtic warriors and Viking raiders. It's a complex tapestry woven from ancient tribes, forgotten migrations, and surprising links to people from as far away as North Africa and Siberia. Through projects like Scotland's DNA Project, researchers have tested thousands of people, uncovering hidden genetic markers that trace back to civilizations long gone. These discoveries don't just add details to Scotland's history, they completely rewrite it. Imagine learning that your ancestors weren't just local farmers or clan warriors but part of an ancient global network that connected Scotland to distant continents thousands of years ago. DNA is more than just a biological code, it's a time capsule. It preserves the stories of survival, migration, and adaptation. Every strand holds clues about ancient peoples who crossed oceans, scaled mountains, and settled in the land we now call Scotland. These genetic breadcrumbs tell us not just where the Scots came from, but how they became who they are today. So, if you thought you knew Scotland's history, think again. The real story is hidden in plain sight, written in the genes of every Scot walking the earth today. Imagine Scotland 12,000 years ago, a land emerging from the grip of the last ice age. Vast sheets of ice that had covered much of the region for thousands of years were finally retreating, revealing a rugged, wild landscape unlike anything we know today. Towering glacier melted into roaring rivers, dense forests began to grow, and animals like reindeer, wild boar, and giant elk roamed freely. Into this raw, untamed world came the very first people to set foot on Scottish soil, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. These early pioneers didn't arrive in large groups or with grand plans of civilization. They were small bands of nomadic people, following herds of animals and the shifting seasons. They traveled north from Europe, tracking the retreating ice, driven by the need to survive in a challenging, unfamiliar land. Their lives were simple yet incredibly tough, dependent on hunting, fishing, and foraging. They crafted sharp tools from flint, built temporary shelters from animal hides and driftwood, and navigated rivers and coastlines in primitive boats. But here's what's truly fascinating. Although they lived over 12,000 years ago, their DNA is still with us today. Recent genetic studies have revealed that traces of their genetic markers are embedded in the DNA of modern Scots. It's a fragile thread, diluted over millennia by waves of migrations, but it's there, a silent witness to Scotland's earliest human history. What did these first Scots look like? Surprisingly, evidence suggests they had dark skin, blue or green eyes, and were robustly built, perfectly adapted to survive harsh environments. Their unique combination of traits challenges the stereotypical image many people have of ancient Europeans. But perhaps even more incredible is how their legacy extends beyond just physical traits. They laid the foundation of Scotland's genetic story. Every generation that followed, from Neolithic farmers to Celtic tribes, carried at least a fragment of their DNA. These hunter-gatherers may not have left behind stone castles or epic legends, but they left something far more enduring, the genetic blueprint of a nation. So, the next time you walk along Scotland's wild coastlines or through its ancient forests, remember, the land you stand on was once home to these resilient people, and if you have Scottish roots, a part of them still lives within you. Fast forward to around 6,000 years ago, and Scotland is on the brink of a transformation that would change the course of its history forever. The era of the hunter-gatherers, who had roamed the land for thousands of years, was coming to an end. A new wave of people arrived, not warriors or conquerors, but farmers. These Neolithic settlers brought with them not just seeds and livestock, but ideas, technologies, and most importantly, a genetic legacy that still shapes Scotland today. These early farmers came from the Near East and Anatolia, regions thousands of miles away from Scotland. Over generations, their descendants migrated westward across Europe, eventually reaching the rugged shores of Britain and the windswept highlands and islands of Scotland. Unlike the nomadic hunter-gatherers, these people had a completely different way of life. They settled in one place, built permanent homes, cultivated crops like barley and wheat, and raised animals such as cattle and sheep. But they didn't just change the landscape, they changed the very DNA of Scotland. Studies have shown that the genetic impact of these Neolithic farmers was profound. In fact, their DNA is more prominent in the modern Scottish population than that of the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Their arrival marked the first major shift in Scotland's genetic makeup, blending with the local population and leaving a lasting imprint that can still be traced today. These settlers also left behind remarkable monuments that stand as silent witnesses to their presence. Think of the Callanish stones on the Isle of Lewis or the Ring of Brugger in Orkney. Massive stone circles aligned with celestial events, built with a level of sophistication that still puzzles archaeologists. These were not just agricultural societies, they were communities with complex spiritual beliefs, social structures, and a deep connection to the land. The Neolithic farmers didn't simply replace the hunter-gatherers, they interacted with them. Over time, the two groups blended both culturally and genetically, creating a new population that carried the legacy of both lineages. This fusion of DNA is still detectable in modern Scots, a testament to how deeply rooted this ancient migration is in Scotland's history. So, when you see the rolling fields of the Scottish countryside or the ancient stone circles standing against the horizon, remember, they are not just part of Scotland's landscape. They are part of its genetic story, carved into the DNA of its people, echoing the lives of those first farmers who dared to settle and thrive in this wild and beautiful land. Around 4,500 years ago, Scotland experienced one of the most dramatic transformations in its history, not through war or conquest, but through the arrival of a new group of people known as the Beaker culture. Named after their distinctive, bell-shaped pottery, the Beaker people didn't just bring new tools and technologies. They brought a genetic shift so profound that it nearly replaced the DNA of Scotland's earlier inhabitants. These migrants came from Central Europe, traveling across the continent and eventually reaching the British Isles. What's astonishing is that recent genetic studies suggest that when the Beaker people arrived, they didn't just settle alongside the existing Neolithic farmers. They almost completely replaced them. In some regions, up to 90% of the local population's genetic ancestry was wiped out within just a few generations. It's one of the most significant population turnovers ever discovered in European prehistory. But how did this happen? Was it through conflict, disease, or something else entirely? While the exact reasons are still debated, it's clear that the Beaker people had advantages that made them dominant. They were skilled metal workers, introducing bronze tools and weapons to Scotland, which gave them an edge in both daily life and possibly in conflicts. They also practiced new burial customs, shifting from large communal tombs to individual graves, each marked with their signature beaker-shaped pottery. Their genetic legacy is undeniable. One of the most striking markers they left behind is a specific Y chromosome type known as R1b, which is now the most common male lineage in Scotland and much of Western Europe. This genetic signature connects modern Scots directly to the Beaker people, making them one of the most influential groups in shaping the population we see today. But the Beaker migration wasn't just about DNA. It also brought new social structures, trade networks, and cultural practices that would shape Scotland's development for centuries. They connected Scotland to a broader European world, trading not just goods like copper and gold but also ideas, technologies, and yes, genes. So, when we talk about Scotland's ancient history, it's impossible to ignore the impact of the Beaker people. They weren't just another wave of settlers. They were a genetic revolution, leaving a legacy that's still carried in the blood of millions of Scots today. As we move forward in Scotland's history, around 3,000 years ago, another transformative wave arrived, not just through migration, but through the spread of a powerful cultural identity. This was the era of the Celts, a diverse group of tribal societies that didn't come from a single homeland but spread across Europe, bringing with them new languages, technologies, and traditions. However, when it comes to Scotland, the story of the Celts is more complex than simple conquest or colonization. For a long time, people believed that the Celts swept into Scotland, replacing the local populations with ease. But recent genetic research tells a different story. Instead of wiping out the earlier inhabitants, the Celts blended with the local populations. In fact, DNA studies suggest that most modern Scots are not descendants of invading Celtic tribes but of the original people who lived there long before the Celts arrived. These local groups simply adopted Celtic culture, language, and customs over time. One of the most fascinating parts of this story is the role of the Picts, a confederation of tribes living in what is now eastern and northern Scotland. The Romans called them Picti, meaning painted people, likely because of their distinctive body art and tattoos. For years, the Picts were considered a mysterious, even vanished people. But DNA analysis reveals that their genetic legacy is very much alive, especially in the northeast of Scotland. They weren't wiped out. They were absorbed into the emerging Scottish identity, their bloodline still flowing through the veins of many Scots today. Meanwhile, in the West and the Highlands, another group, the Gaels, rose to prominence. They brought the Gaelic language, which would become deeply rooted in Scottish culture. To this day, Gaelic is still spoken in parts of Scotland, a living testament to this ancient migration. Interestingly, while the Picts and Gaels are often seen as separate groups, their DNA shows a story of interconnection rather than division. The Celts also introduced new metalworking techniques, creating intricate jewelry and weapons that reflected their artistic flair. Their influence is visible in Scotland's ancient hill forts, burial mounds, and even the legendary knotwork designs still associated with Celtic art today. But beneath these cultural symbols lies the real story, the genetic evidence that shows how ancient Scots didn't just adopt Celtic customs, they helped shape them. So, the next time you hear the word Celtic, remember, it's not just about art, music, or mythology. It's a living connection between past and present, carried not just in language and culture but deep within the DNA of Scotland's people. When we think of Scottish ancestry, we often picture rugged Highlanders, Celtic warriors, or Viking settlers. But what if I told you that hidden within Scottish DNA are connections to places as distant and unexpected as the Sahara Desert and the icy plains of Siberia? It might sound unbelievable, but recent genetic studies have uncovered surprising links that rewrite what we thought we knew about Scotland's ancient past. Let's start with one of the most astonishing discoveries, North African DNA in Scotland. Researchers found that around 1% of Scottish men carry a genetic marker that traces directly back to the Berber and Tuareg tribes of the Sahara Desert. This lineage is over 5,600 years old, making it one of the oldest genetic connections in Scotland. But how did it get there? The answer lies in ancient trade routes that connected distant parts of the world long before written history. It's believed that this North African DNA marker spread from the Sahara to Spain during the time of the Moorish conquest, then moved along the Atlantic coast through France and eventually reached Scotland. It's a silent witness to a time when people, goods, and cultures were more interconnected than we often imagine. Even though these migrations happened thousands of years ago, the genetic footprint remains, a hidden link between the sands of the Sahara and the green hills of Scotland. But that's not the only surprise. Scotland also has genetic ties to Siberia, specifically in places like the Orkney Islands. How could this be? The key lies with the ancient Yemnaya culture, a group of steppe herders from the Pontic-Caspian region, what is now parts of Ukraine and southern Russia. who migrated westward around 5,000 years ago. As they moved, they brought not just their language and culture but their DNA, which spread across Europe and eventually reached the northern edges of Scotland. In Orkney, scientists found Siberian-derived genetic markers at higher frequencies than in other parts of Britain. This suggests that ancient migration waves, possibly through connections with early European maritime networks, carried these genes all the way to Scotland's remote islands. While the overall genetic influence from Siberia is small, it's a powerful reminder that ancient people traveled vast distances, much farther than we might expect, long before modern transportation existed. These unexpected connections show that Scotland was never isolated. Even thousands of years ago, it was part of a global web of migrations and cultural exchanges. Every strand of DNA holds clues to journeys that spanned continents, crossing deserts, mountains, and seas. So, while Scotland's landscape may seem remote and rugged, its people carry within them the story of a world that was always connected, through bloodlines that stretch from the heart of Africa to the frozen lands of Siberia. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine fierce warriors with horned helmets, raiding coastal villages and leaving destruction in their wake. But the real story of the Viking Age in Scotland, which began around 793 AD, is far more complex and far more influential than just battles and raids. The Vikings didn't just pass through Scotland, they settled, integrated, and left behind a genetic legacy that still shapes the DNA of modern Scots today. The first Viking raids targeted monasteries like Lindisfarne, but it wasn't long before they set their sights on Scotland's coasts and islands. Places like Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides became key Viking strongholds. However, these Norse seafarers didn't remain raiders for long. They established permanent settlements, built farms, married into local families, and created thriving communities. Today, the genetic impact of these Norse settlers is undeniable. Studies show that in Orkney, up to 25% of the population's DNA can be traced directly back to Norwegian Viking ancestors. In Shetland, that number is even higher, reaching around 30%. But the Viking influence didn't stop at the islands. Even on the Scottish mainland, Norse DNA is present, though in smaller amounts, averaging around 4% in various regions. What's fascinating is that the Vikings didn't just contribute male lineage through their warrior ancestors. DNA evidence shows that Norse women also settled in Scotland, suggesting that entire families migrated, not just raiding parties. This blending of Norse and local Scottish populations created a unique cultural fusion known as the Norse-Gaelic hybrid society, especially prominent in the Hebrides and along the western coast. This Norse influence wasn't limited to genetics. It shaped language, law, and even place names. Many locations in northern Scotland still carry names of Viking origin. Ness, Wick, and by are common suffixes in areas with strong Norse heritage. Even the famous Thing sites, where Viking assemblies met to govern, can still be found in parts of Scotland. Culturally, the Vikings left behind artifacts, burial mounds, and stone carvings that tell stories of a society that was as much about trade, farming, and craftsmanship as it was about warfare. The Viking ships that once crossed the North Sea didn't just carry warriors. They carried merchants, farmers, artisans, and families, all seeking new lives in distant lands. So, while the image of the Viking raider is dramatic, the real legacy of the Norse in Scotland is found not just in ancient artifacts but in the very DNA of the people who live there today. The Vikings didn't just leave a mark, they became part of the fabric of Scottish history. Their genetic threads woven into the story of a nation that was shaped by both conflict and connection. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Britain entered a new era of migrations and cultural shifts. Among the most influential groups to shape Scotland's history during this period were the Anglo-Saxons and, later, the Normans. While their impact is often overshadowed by the dramatic stories of Vikings and Celts, their presence left both a cultural and genetic footprint that continues to be seen in modern Scots today. The Anglo-Saxons, originating from regions that are now part of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, began settling in Britain around the 5th century AD. Though they primarily established themselves in what is now England, their influence eventually extended northward into southern Scotland, particularly in areas like Lothian and the Borders. These weren't just raiding parties or small communities, they brought with them entire agricultural systems, languages, and social structures. Genetic studies have revealed that while the Anglo-Saxon presence in Scotland wasn't as dominant as in England, their DNA is still detectable, especially in the southeast regions. People living in these areas often carry genetic markers linked to Anglo-Saxon ancestry. This influence is also reflected in language. The early form of Old English, brought by Anglo-Saxon settlers, eventually evolved into what we now recognize as the Scots language, spoken in the lowlands. Moving forward to the 11th century, Scotland experienced another wave of influence with the arrival of the Normans following the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans didn't invade Scotland militarily. Instead, they arrived through diplomatic ties, intermarriage, and royal invitation, especially during the reign of King David I, who actively encouraged Norman nobles to settle in Scotland. The Normans introduced significant changes, particularly in Scotland's political and social structures. They brought with them the feudal system, reshaping how land was owned and governed. They also introduced castle-building techniques, many of which still stand today as symbols of medieval power. Names like Bruce, Stuart, and Fraser, prominent in Scottish history, have Norman roots, and many of the noble families who shaped Scotland's destiny during the medieval period carried Norman blood. But what about their genetic impact? While the Normans were fewer in number compared to earlier migratory groups, their genetic legacy is particularly noticeable among the Scottish nobility. DNA studies have shown that certain Y chromosome markers, often associated with Norman lineages, appear more frequently in families with aristocratic backgrounds. This influence was more cultural and political than widespread across the general population, but it left a lasting mark nonetheless. What's fascinating is how these two groups, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, helped create a cultural divide in Scotland that's still visible today. The lowlands, with stronger Anglo-Saxon and Norman influences, developed differently from the Gaelic-speaking highlands, leading to distinct languages, customs, and even genetic patterns. So, while the Celts and Vikings often steal the spotlight, the story of Scotland's DNA wouldn't be complete without the quieter, yet deeply rooted, contributions of the Anglo-Saxons and Normans. Their legacy isn't just found in history books. It's written in the genes of the Scottish people, woven into the fabric of a nation shaped by waves of migration, adaptation, and resilience. Have you ever wondered what your surname says about your ancestry? In Scotland, surnames aren't just labels, they are living connections to the past, often holding clues about ancient lineages, tribal affiliations, and even royal bloodlines. But what's even more fascinating is how surnames can align with genetic markers, revealing hidden stories about migrations, conquests, and forgotten tribes woven into Scotland's history. Let's start with the most iconic Scottish surnames, those beginning with Mec or MC, which means son of in Gaelic. Names like MacDonald, son of Donald, and MacGregor, son of Gregor, aren't just family names. They trace back to clan systems that have existed for centuries. Genetic studies show that people sharing these surnames often have common paternal ancestors, confirmed through specific Y chromosome markers passed down from father to son. In fact, when researchers analyzed the DNA of men with the surname Stuart, they discovered that about 15% of them are direct descendants of the royal line of Scottish kings, carrying what's been dubbed royal DNA. But surnames don't just tell us about Gaelic roots. Some carry the legacy of Scotland's mysterious Pictish tribes. Names like Ross, Forbes, and Keith are thought to have Pictish origins, often tied to ancient territories in the northeast. Despite the Picts disappearing from historical records, their genetic markers still exist in modern Scots, and these surnames act as breadcrumbs leading back to that lost culture. Now, let's talk about the Viking influence, which left a distinct mark on Scottish surnames, especially in the Northern Isles. Names like MacLeod, Gunn, and Sutherland have strong Norse roots. Interestingly, Sutherland means southern land, but from the Viking perspective, looking south from Norway. DNA analysis in regions like Orkney and Shetland shows high concentrations of Norse genetic markers, perfectly aligning with the spread of these Viking surnames. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 didn't just reshape English history, it also influenced Scotland. Names like Bruce, Fraser, and Sinclair trace back to Norman families invited to Scotland by kings like David I. Although the Normans left a stronger cultural than genetic impact overall, their Y chromosome signatures can still be found in descendants of Scotland's medieval aristocracy. And then there's the Anglo-Saxon legacy, visible in surnames like Armstrong and Douglas. These names often have descriptive origins. Armstrong likely referred to someone known for physical strength. In regions like the Scottish borders, where Anglo-Saxon influence was strong, these surnames frequently align with genetic markers typical of Anglo-Saxon ancestry. Surnames can even tell us about occupations and places of origin. Take McIntyre, meaning son of the carpenter, or Dunbar, which translates to fort on the headland. These names not only hint at what your ancestors did or where they lived, but also connect to genetic clusters identified in modern DNA studies. So, the next time you hear a Scottish surname, remember, it's more than just a name. It's a genetic clue, a key that unlocks stories of ancient clans, royal dynasties, Viking voyages, and even lost tribes. It's a living thread that ties modern Scots to the distant past, woven into the very DNA that shapes who they are today. History is filled with tales of ancient tribes that seem to vanish without a trace, their stories fading into legend. One such tribe is the Maeatae, fierce warriors who once roamed the area around present-day Stirling in central Scotland. For centuries, historians believed the Maeatae had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only faint mentions in Roman records. But recent genetic studies have revealed a surprising twist. The Maeatae never truly vanished. In fact, their DNA still exists in the people of Scotland today. The Maeatae were first recorded around 208 AD, when they fiercely resisted Roman expansion. Described as a confederation of tribes living near the Antonine Wall, they were known for their relentless defiance against Roman legions. Historical texts suggest they played a key role in the battles that eventually forced the Romans to retreat from Scotland, leaving the northern lands unconquered. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Maeatae seemingly disappeared from historical records, leading many to believe they had been wiped out or absorbed by other tribes. However, modern genetics tells a different story. Scientists analyzing the DNA of people living around Stirling and the Ochil Hills, regions historically linked to the Maeatae, discovered unique genetic markers that aren't commonly found elsewhere in Scotland. These markers form a distinct genetic cluster, suggesting a direct link to the ancient Maeatae. This discovery challenges the long-held belief that the tribe simply faded away. Instead, it appears they merged with neighboring groups, their identity living on quietly through generations of descendants. What makes this even more fascinating is how DNA filled the gaps where history had gone silent. There were no grand monuments or detailed records left behind by the Maeatae, but their legacy was hidden in plain sight, within the genetic code of the people who still live on the same land their ancestors once defended. This is a powerful reminder that history isn't just written in books, it's also written in our blood. The rediscovery of the Maeatae through DNA doesn't just tell us about one lost tribe, it reveals how many more stories might be hidden in the genes of people around the world. It shows that even when names fade from maps and languages disappear, the genetic footprints of ancient peoples remain, waiting to be uncovered. So, the next time you walk through Stirling's rolling hills or pass by the ancient sites near the Antonine Wall, remember, you're walking on land that holds the echoes of a tribe thought to be lost. And if you have Scottish ancestry, you might even carry a piece of their story within you, proof that the Maeatae never truly disappeared. When we think of Scotland, we often imagine its breathtaking landscapes, towering mountains, misty lochs, and ancient castles perched on rugged cliffs. But beneath this dramatic scenery lies another landscape, one invisible to the eye yet just as fascinating: Scotland's genetic map. Recent studies have revealed that Scotland isn't just one homogeneous population. Instead, it's made up of distinct regional genetic clusters, each holding clues to the migrations, settlements, and ancient peoples that shaped the country over thousands of years. Thanks to groundbreaking projects like the ScotlandHistory project, scientists have been able to analyze DNA from thousands of people across the country. Their research identified 6 major genetic clusters: the Borders, the Southwest, the Hebrides, the Northeast, Orkney, and Shetland. What's fascinating is how these clusters often align with ancient historical territories, reflecting events that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago. For example, there's a clear genetic divide between the northeast and the southwest of Scotland, roughly following the line of the River Forth. This division isn't random. It mirrors the ancient boundary between the lands once dominated by the Picts in the northeast and the Gaels in the southwest. Even though these cultural groups merged over time, their genetic signatures remain distinct, showing how powerful ancient identities can be, lingering silently in the DNA of modern Scots. In the Hebrides, we see something even more intriguing. The islands form what scientists call a genetic island, a population that remained relatively isolated over centuries, developing unique genetic characteristics. Because of this isolation, people from the Hebrides carry DNA markers that are less common on the mainland, providing a genetic snapshot of ancient populations that settled there long ago. Moving further north to Orkney and Shetland, the genetic picture shifts again. These islands have some of the highest levels of Norse Viking ancestry outside of Scandinavia. In Shetland, up to 30% of the population's DNA can be traced back to Viking settlers. Even today, the strong Norse influence isn't just found in place names or cultural traditions, it's literally embedded in the genes of the people. One of the most surprising findings from these studies is the genetic connection between the Isle of Man and southwestern Scotland. Despite being separated by the Irish Sea, people from these regions share more genetic similarities than you might expect. This reflects the deep historical ties between the two areas, dating back to ancient maritime networks and Viking-era migrations. These regional differences in DNA help explain why certain genetic diseases or traits are more common in specific parts of Scotland. They also reveal how historical events like the Viking invasions, the spread of Gaelic culture, and even ancient tribal boundaries have left lasting marks on Scotland's population, not just culturally, but biologically. So, while maps of Scotland show mountains, rivers, and borders, the real map of Scotland's history is written in its people. Every region, every community, carries a unique genetic signature, a story etched not on paper, but in the very cells of its people, connecting them to ancient ancestors whose names may be lost to time, but whose legacy lives on. When we think of Scotland's history, we often picture it rooted firmly in its rugged highlands, ancient castles, and misty lochs. But what if I told you that Scotland's story doesn't end at its borders? In fact, the genetic legacy of the Scottish people stretches far beyond the hills and glens, weaving its way across continents, carried in the DNA of millions of people around the world. Throughout history, waves of migration have carried Scottish bloodlines to distant lands. Some of the most significant migrations happened during the Highland clearances in the 18th and 19th centuries, when thousands of Scots were forced to leave their ancestral homes due to economic hardships and changes in land ownership. Many of these displaced families set sail for new opportunities in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. But this wasn't the first time Scots had ventured far from home. Even earlier, during the time of the Ulster plantations in the 17th century, Scottish settlers moved to Ireland, creating the Ulster Scots community, which later contributed significantly to the population of Scotch-Irish immigrants in North America. These migrations weren't just historical events. They created lasting genetic footprints. Today, millions of people in North America carry Scottish ancestry, even if they don't know it. Thanks to modern DNA testing, many people are now discovering their unexpected Scottish roots. Genetic markers specific to certain Scottish clans or regions can show up in DNA results, revealing connections to ancestors who left Scotland generations ago. For example, people with surnames like MacDonald, Fraser, or Campbell often find direct links to ancient Scottish lineages, sometimes even tracing back to specific clans or territories. What's truly fascinating is how regional genetic patterns have survived, even across oceans. In places like Nova Scotia, which literally means New Scotland, you'll find communities where the Gaelic language is still spoken, and where Scottish genetic markers are common. In the Appalachian region of the United States, many families with deep roots in the area have DNA connections to the Scotch-Irish settlers who arrived there centuries ago. Even beyond these well-known migrations, Scottish DNA has quietly made its way into unexpected corners of the world. During the time of the British Empire, Scots served as soldiers, administrators, and traders in countries across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Their descendants, often unaware of their heritage, carry genetic markers that tell stories of journeys and lives that spanned continents. But it's not just about where Scots went. It's also about what they brought with them. Along with their genes, they carried traditions, languages, and stories that shaped the cultures of the places they settled. The echoes of Scottish history can be heard in the folk music of Appalachia, seen in the tartan parades of Nova Scotia, and even tasted in the whiskey distilleries of Tasmania. So, while Scotland may be a small country geographically, its genetic legacy is global. Whether through ancient migrations or modern diaspora, the story of Scotland lives on, not just in history books, but in the DNA of people around the world. Every time someone uncovers a hidden Scottish connection in their ancestry, they are rediscovering a piece of a story that began thousands of years ago, in the hills and glens of a land that has shaped far more than just its own borders. Imagine if you could step into a time machine, not one made of gears and metal, but something far more powerful, hidden inside you. Your DNA is that time machine. It holds the story of your ancestors, tracing back thousands of years through migrations, conquests, and civilizations long forgotten. In Scotland, this genetic time machine reveals a history more complex, diverse, and surprising than anything written in books. Scotland's DNA tells a story that stretches from the very dawn of human settlement to the modern day. It begins with the first hunter-gatherers who arrived as the ice sheets of the last ice age melted away around 12,000 years ago. Though their world has vanished, fragments of their DNA still exist in modern Scots, a living echo of people who hunted, fished, and roamed a wild, untamed landscape. Then came the Neolithic farmers, bringing with them not just agriculture but also new genes from the Near East. They transformed the land and left their mark on Scotland's DNA, alongside the Beaker people, whose arrival around 4,500 years ago sparked one of the most dramatic genetic turnovers in European history. Their genes replaced much of the earlier population, yet traces of those ancient lineages still endure, woven into the fabric of modern Scottish identities. The story continues with the rise of the Celts, the mysterious Picts, and the arrival of the Vikings, whose DNA remains especially strong in places like Orkney and Shetland. Add to that the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans, and even distant genetic connections to North Africa and Siberia, unexpected links that show Scotland has never been isolated, but part of a vast web of human movement across the globe. But what's truly remarkable is how resilient ancient genetic markers are. Despite centuries of invasions, wars, and migrations, Scotland's DNA still holds the fingerprints of its earliest inhabitants. Even after thousands of years, scientists can trace specific Y chromosome markers back to ancient tribes, like the Maeatae, once thought lost to history. And this isn't just about the past, it's about how that past lives on today. The way people look, the languages they speak, even the surnames they carry are all shaped by the migrations and genetic blending of their ancestors. Every Scottish surname, from MacDonald to Fraser, holds a key to a deeper genetic story. In many ways, DNA connects us to a history we never knew we had. With modern genetic testing, people around the world are discovering unexpected Scottish roots, uncovering connections to clans, regions, and ancient peoples they never imagined were part of their story. Some find links to royal bloodlines, others to forgotten tribes, and many to distant lands, proving that the threads of history are far more interconnected than we often realize. So, while we may not have a real-time machine, our DNA offers something just as extraordinary, a way to travel back through generations, uncovering the hidden chapters of human history. Scotland's genetic story is still being written, not just in the land itself, but in the lives of people across the globe who carry a piece of that story within them. Scotland's story isn't just one of ancient warriors, lost tribes, or distant migrations. It's a story that lives on, written in the DNA of millions of people around the world. From the first hunter-gatherers who roamed its wild landscapes to the Vikings who sailed across its rugged coasts, every chapter of this rich history has left its mark, not just in the land but in the people themselves. We've uncovered the hidden connections between Scots and distant regions like North Africa and Siberia, explored the mysteries of lost tribes like the Maeatae, and seen how ancient migrations shaped not only Scotland's culture but its very genetic makeup. But the journey doesn't end here. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Which DNA discovery surprised you the most? Was it the unexpected connection to the Berber tribes of the Sahara, the strong Viking influence in the Orkney Islands, or perhaps the realization that ancient Pictish DNA is still alive and well in Scotland today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Your story might inspire someone else to uncover their own hidden history. If you enjoyed this journey through Scotland's genetic past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the untold stories of history. And if you're curious to learn more about the genetic journeys of other regions, check out our videos on Irish DNA, Spanish ancestry, and more. Thanks for joining us on this incredible genetic adventure. The story of Scotland's DNA isn't just history. It's living, breathing, and still evolving, one generation at a time.